I welcome you this evening to Greensboro, North Carolina, for those of you from out of town, to the campus of Greensboro College, and to the Huggins Performance Center here in Odell Building. Tonight, our lecture series continues for the academic year 2013-14 with a presentation by Graham Hancock, who we'll hear from in just a moment, presented by the Department of Sociology and the BB&T Ethics Across the Curriculum Initiative. I will now introduce the gentleman who will introduce our speaker. Jonathan Epstein joined us just this year. He is a professor of sociology and is the director of our new online criminal justice administration program, which will launch in January. Dr. Epstein has taught at Salem College, High Point University, the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and New Mexico State University. He holds degrees in sociology, the bachelor's and master's from UNCG, and his doctorate from Kent State University. He is also a musician. He is an artist. He is a Renaissance man, and has actually done some very important work with anti-terrorism and anti-hate crime work in the Midwest. It is therefore my privilege to introduce, for the introduction of our speaker this evening, Dr. Jonathan Epstein.
Well, hello. Wow, there's a lot of you out there. Yay. Welcome to Greensboro College. Thank you, Dr. Zarda, for introducing the person who's going to make the introductions. That's a college thing. And I'm very excited tonight to be able to introduce Graham Hancock, who is here from the UK to talk about some research he's been doing on a new book, which is a follow-up to his classic text, Fingerprints of the Gods. I also want to point out that his partner, Sam Fagan, those of us who have read Graham's book are very familiar with her photography, and afterwards you should probably, if you're interested in photography, have a chat with her. What a great job. Anyway, 1995 was quite a year for me. I took a job at Wake Forest University, I completed my dissertation, and my former sister-in-law gave me an advanced copy of a book called Fingerprints of the Gods. I was a sociologist, knew nothing about archaeology. She said, check this out, you might like it. First chapter in, I was like, oh my God, who is this guy? What is he talking about? These questions are awesome. That's being a sociologist. We like the questions, and we don't mind the uncomfortable answers because they bring up new questions. Graham, when he first wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, really went out on a limb and said, I think there's something more to this story. There was. 20 years later, it turns out that a lot of the things that Graham wrote about in that book turned out to probably be true. Or at least there's enough evidence for us to continue to look, which is, after all, science. Which is why I asked Graham here today. Because it's the kind of thinking, the kind of questioning, the reason to chase those questions is what I want my students to do. It's what I'm trying to teach them to do. Don't be afraid to ask the question. Don't be afraid to look for the answer. Please, our future depends on you doing that. And you should realize that. Anyway, boy, that was a lot. I'm going to introduce to you Graham Hancock. Graham?
So now, as promised, we will go on with the main purpose of the evening, which is the work that I've been doing for the last year or so to prepare a sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods, my best-known book. Fingerprints of the Gods was published in 1995. That's coming up for 20 years ago now. And what happened immediately after Fingerprints of the Gods was published was that there was an enormous academic backlash. And I came under the most withering and personal attack, which went on without remit for several years. The only thing that relieved it for me was the recognition that this is what archaeologists do to each other as well. It's not just that they attack outsiders, they attack each other like ferocious killer dogs also. And really I was just being subjected to what they subject themselves to, which was My sin, my crime, was that the book was successful. If the book had, which told an alternative story of history, if the book had failed dismally and had disappeared from public view, nobody would have bothered. But because the book was prominent, it was necessary to attack its author. And I learned a lot from those attacks. What has happened in subsequent years is that there have been many intriguing new developments in the field of human prehistory, which raise again the possibility that I raised in Fingerprints of the Gods, that there has been a great forgotten episode in human history. And what I want to do tonight is to review some of the more important findings that I presented in Fingerprints of the Gods itself, and link them to some of the new evidence and information that I am now focusing on, because the new book will not be an updated version of Fingerprints of the Gods. It will be a completely new book with completely new information in it. Before I go on, I want to thank my wife and partner, Santha, without whom I certainly would not be here. In fact, I doubt if I would even be alive. Santha has saved my life so many times in so many ways over the years. Santha is a photographer, and almost all the images that we're going to see from now on were taken by Santha. She's shared every adventure with me at the bottom of the ocean, at the top of the Great Pyramid. Santha's always been there for the last 22 years, and I would have done nothing if she hadn't been by my side, so thank you, Santha. One of the arguments that was made about pyramids when I published Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995, see, I said, look, it's really weird that we find this thing called a pyramid all around the world. It seems like there's some connection between them, and the academic argument to this was there can be no connection between the pyramids of the Old World and the pyramid of the New World, because the pyramids of the New World are all much younger than the pyramids of the Old World. So you can't claim that the Giza pyramids are connected in any way to the pyramids of the Americas, because no pyramids were built in the Americas until at least 1,000 or 1,200 years after the Giza pyramids were built. And the Giza pyramids were built round about, according to Orthodox chronology, round about 2,500 BC. Well, this, for me, is an example of what I regard as the hubris of archaeologists, because what they forget is that the next turn of the spade may reveal evidence that confounds their argument. And this has certainly happened in the case of pyramids. And I want to make this point simply to say that we should regard all archaeology and all our ideas of prehistory as provisional. And Caral is a pyramid site about 200 kilometers north of Lima in Peru, which has been excavated over the past 10 years. And we now know that Caral does date to 2,500 BC, to exactly the same period as the Giza pyramids. Now, these pyramids are not on the same scale as the Giza pyramids, but they are nevertheless pyramids, and the basic concept of the pyramid, therefore, appeared in the New World and the Old World apparently at exactly the same time. And that, for me, continues to be a mystery. Bandurria is in many ways an even more fascinating site than Caral. Bandurria is about 65 kilometers south of Caral. Hardly anybody goes there. But there, it is actually even older than Caral. It's about 3000 BC. And we have huge pyramids there and very sophisticated architecture in the form of these semi-subterranean courtyards in front of the pyramids. And it stands on the edge of the sea. I've long been of the opinion that the Giza pyramids cannot be divorced from ancient Egypt. I think that the Giza site is much more complicated than Egyptologists maintain it to be. I do agree that ancient Egyptians were involved massively in the pyramids and in the completion of the pyramids. But I believe that the origins of the site are much older. And it's intriguing to me that exactly the same time that there was this burst of pyramid building energy in Egypt, we now know that there was a burst of pyramid building energy in South America. And I can't help feeling that these two issues are connected. But what I'm going to talk about today is much older than 3000 BC. This is the cover of the 5th of October 2013 edition of the New Scientist magazine. The New Scientist magazine was one of those magazines, friends of archaeologists, who took delight in attacking me in 1995 and onwards for my outrageous suggestion that civilization might be far older and more mysterious than we thought. So I couldn't help feeling just a certain sense of vindication when New Scientist came out in October 2013 with the statement that civilization is older and more mysterious than we thought. This is based on new discoveries principally in Turkey, and I'm going to talk about those new discoveries tonight. But before I get there, I want to go back to Giza, and as I said, I want to review some of the evidence that I covered in Fingerprints of the Gods before we go on to the new evidence. So this is the Great Pyramid of Egypt, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. And here are some statistics. It's 481 feet high. It has a footprint at the base of 13.1 acres. It weighs 6 million tons. The number of blocks is 2.3 million, and it was once covered in highly polished limestone casing stones, most of which are gone now. They came off in an earthquake in 1301, and they were reused in the construction of many mosques and palaces throughout Cairo. But there were once 115,000 of those shaped blocks weighing 10 tons each. Now, here is the southwest corner of the Great Pyramid, and the angle of slope is 52 degrees. Every corridor inside the Great Pyramid slopes at 26 degrees, which is half of that angle of slope. If you want to climb the Great Pyramid illegally, that is the corner to go up. That is the best corner to climb. I've climbed the Great Pyramid 5 times, 3 times illegally, twice legally. Nobody can climb it legally anymore. The other corners are very heavily eroded, but this one provides you with a nice, clear line to get up to the top. And I do highly recommend it. This is the 3 Great Pyramids of Giza towering over the city of Cairo today, and casting into shame the modern architecture of Cairo. And Santa took this photograph from an Egyptian military helicopter hovering over the village of Nazlet al-Saman, which stands on the northeast of the Giza Plateau. And you can see the gigantic forms of the 3 Great Pyramids rearing up on the plateau itself. And it's a sign of how big they are that most people who don't know the site well don't immediately see the Sphinx in this photograph. The Sphinx is 270 feet high and 70 feet long, and it is present in the photograph, and that's in fact the Sphinx there. So there's the Great Sphinx, and there's the 3 Great Pyramids of Giza. Let's sweep round now to the northwest side of the 3 pyramids, and we can see why Egypt is referred to by the ancients as the gift of the Nile. Because there's the Nile Valley, fertile and rich, and there off to the west is the western desert, sere, inhospitable, unsupportive of life. And right at the junction of the 2 zones stand the 3 Great Pyramids. And again, the Great Sphinx is there in the picture, gazing east over the Nile Valley. Let's go closer now. These are the north faces of the 3 Great Pyramids, where the true entrances are housed. And there on the top of the Great Pyramid itself, we can see that there's half a course of masonry left in place. We don't know if the Great Pyramid was ever completed, whether the pyramidion was ever placed on top of it, or whether it came off during an earthquake. It's one of those mysteries. But what we can know is what the true height of the Great Pyramid would originally have been by just extending the corners on upwards. I've told this story a number of times, but I have to tell it again. For those who've heard it before, forgive me. There I am, a younger man, some years before I had my hip replaced, at the top of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And at my feet, you can perhaps make out the multiple fragments of graffiti that are carved into the top of the Great Pyramid. Many, many people have left their names there. And that's where I found, one step down, just below me, my own name, carved, the name Hancock, preceded by the initial P. My grandfather was called Philip Hancock, and the date that followed the name P. Hancock was the 5th of April 1916. And I knew my grandfather had been in Egypt in the First World War. He was a chaplain with British forces. So when I got down from the pyramid that day, I called my dad, who was still alive at the time, and I asked him to dig out Grandpa's diaries from his desk drawer. My grandpa used to write his diaries, little diaries about that big. And I said, go find the date 5th of April 1916 and tell me what it says. So I heard my father rustling through the pages, and finally he came back on the line and he said, there's just one line here. And I said, well, just tell me what it says, will you? And he said, climbed Great Pyramid today. So that's my connection with the Great Pyramid of Giza, which stands on latitude 30 degrees north, which is a significant latitude. It's 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. And this is one of the ways in which the Great Pyramid speaks to the planet on which it is built. Another way in which the Great Pyramid speaks to the planet on which it is built is its almost perfect alignment to true north. It's just 3/60ths of a single degree off true north. We're not talking about magnetic north here, which varies. We're talking about true astronomical north. This is one of the reasons why I personally don't buy the ancient aliens hypothesis. I've yet to see a monument anywhere on planet Earth, and I have seen a lot of ancient monuments, where I need aliens capable of crossing interstellar space in order to explain that monument. I've got nothing against aliens. I'm sure the universe is filled with life, and that's what it's for, actually. But I don't need the level of technology that would enable aliens to cross interstellar space to explain the Great Pyramid. And I believe that if you can cross interstellar space, then you'd get your alignment to true north spot on, not 3/60ths of a degree off. Something else you'd do is you'd get the side lengths of the Great Pyramid exactly the same. Actually, they vary by as much as 7 inches, which again is uncanny accuracy for human workmanship. But it's human workmanship. It's not alien workmanship. It's not interstellar space workmanship. And I do feel that the ancient alien hypothesis trivializes the mystery in many ways. You know, we don't understand it, so it must be aliens. I think it's possible that we are dealing with an unknown level of human achievement which does not fit into the historical picture, and I prefer that explanation. So the Great Pyramid is aligned to true north within 3/60ths of a single degree, and that's a stunning achievement on a 13-acre monument that weighs 6 million tons and is 481 feet high. And here's something else about the way the pyramid speaks to the Earth, and that's what I call the pyramid-Earth ratio, which I outlined in Fingerprints of the Gods. It's a simple fact of mathematics that if you take the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and measure it carefully and multiply by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. It prints out the equatorial circumference of the Earth. And if you take the height of the Great Pyramid, the true height, and multiply that by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. So it seems that the Great Pyramid is a sort of mathematical scale model of a hemisphere of our planet. And actually Egyptologists know this, and they say, like everything else, that it's just a coincidence, that there's no choice, nothing purposeful about that, because how could the ancient Egyptians have done that? They didn't even know that they lived on a planet, never mind the dimensions of the planet. But here's the problem with that argument. This number 43,200 is not a random number. This number 43,200 is actually a highly significant number, and it also relates to the planet Earth and to the key motions of the planet Earth. And it relates specifically to a motion called the precession of the equinoxes. It's said that there's a wobble on the axis of the Earth, rather like a top that's been set spinning and slows down, and that this wobble is caused by the pull of the sun and the moon on the Earth. and that this wobble means that the extended north pole of the Earth transcribes a great circle in the heavens over a huge period of time, 25,920 years. So today, our North Pole points at Polaris, that's our pole star. But that in previous periods of history, it's pointed at empty space or at other stars. So that's one way in which precession is observable. The other way it's observable is on the horizon, where the sun rises at particular moments of the year. It's not that the rising point of the sun changes, but what changes is the background stars that rise behind the sun. And this is the precession of the equinoxes. And it unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And 43,200 is in fact a multiple of 72. So the scale that's been used is not a random scale. And just to make this point, that many numbers are generated by the number 72, like 36, which is half of 72, or 108, or 2,160, which is 72 times 30, or 4,320, or 43,200. And these numbers are found all over the world. They're found in the Mayan calendar, where all of the key numbers are multiples or divisors of 72. And they're found in myths and traditions all around the world. Don't take my word for it. Go read Giorgio de Santillana, who was a professor of the history of science at MIT, and Hertha von Descher, and read their book Hamlet's Mill. I had to read it 5 times before I got it. It's a really difficult book. Read Hamlet's Mill, and you will find there, hidden away in that vast academic tome, the statement that some almost unbelievable ancestor culture had deliberately encoded the numbers relating to precession of the equinoxes in myths. And they don't know why it did that, but it was determined to pass down to the future this information. And the way to do it was to encode it in fantastic stories, which people would keep on telling down the generations from age to age, even if the storyteller had no idea what information was actually being conveyed. As long as they told the story true, the numbers would continue to be passed down. Now, the Great Sphinx is part of a processional project at Giza. The Great Sphinx, which has between its paws a stela that tells us it marks the splendid place of the first time. The first time is a concept in ancient Egypt. They called it Zep Tepi, when the gods walked the earth. That stela was not put there at the time the Sphinx was built. It was put there by Pharaoh Thutmose IV, who in a dream was told that he had to restore the Sphinx. And that's why it's called the Dream Stela. In the 13th line of the hieroglyphs on that stela, until about 100 years ago, appeared a single syllable, kaf. And on the basis of that kaf, the rest of the line had withered away. On the basis of that single syllable kaf, Egyptology has opted to give the Sphinx to Khafre, a pharaoh of the 4th dynasty. Now, if you're going to say that was Khafre, it should have had a royal cartouche around it, which surrounds the names of royal figures in ancient Egypt. There was no cartouche. And actually that single syllable is not even there anymore. But even if it referred to Khafre, how do we know that Thutmose was telling us that Khafre built the Sphinx? Maybe he was telling us that Khafre was an earlier restorer of the Sphinx. We don't know what he was saying. And what is ignored is the other statement that the Sphinx marks the splendid place of the first time. This is what you see if you get up illegally on the back of the Sphinx. You see the back of the Sphinx's head, of course. And if you were there on the summer solstice, you would see the sun rising over here, far to the north of east. Should you be there on the winter solstice, the sun is rising here, far to the south of east. But if you get up on the back of the Sphinx on the spring equinox, then you'll find what the Sphinx is really built to do. It's built to gaze at the rising sun on that day when night and day are of equal length. The rising sun exactly in alignment with the gaze of the Sphinx. And it's important to be clear that that rising position of the sun never changes, but it's the stars behind the sun that change. And because they're on the path of the sun, they're the stars of the zodiac. And the precessional motion through the zodiac unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. Yes, indeed, we do live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. This is a reference to precession of the equinoxes. The astronomical characteristics of the Great Pyramid are very clear, and my friend and colleague Robert Bauval was the first person to really draw attention to this with his book The Orion Mystery, published in 1994, which showed that the Great Pyramids are a model on the ground of the three stars of the belt of Orion. And a couple of years later, Robert and I produced a book called The Message of the Sphinx, in which we used computer software to derive this diagram. You can simulate the precessional motions of the stars easily with computers, and it's just a fact, could be a coincidence, but we don't think it is, that at dawn on the spring equinox in 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago, you have the sun, of course, rising perfectly due east, and it's housed by the constellation of Leo, the lion, and the Sphinx, of course, is a lion-bodied monument. I have to say that you'd have to be astronomically illiterate, which the ancient Egyptians certainly were not, to build an equinoctial marker in the form of a lion in 2500 BC, which was the age of Taurus, the bull. If you were going to build an equinoctial marker in 2500 BC, you should build it in the form of a bull, not in the form of a lion. But we have a lion-bodied Sphinx, and at exactly the moment that the sun strikes the horizon, the constellation of Orion is lying due south on the meridian, with its three belt stars in the pattern of the three Great Pyramids. Even the Nile River seems to match the Milky Way in the heavens. I'm not saying that whoever created this amazing place actually put the Nile River there, but what I am saying is that the place may have been chosen for that reason, because it helped them to create this huge diagram, speaking to the period that in our calendar is between 10,000 and 11,000 BC. Between 12 and 13,000 years ago, and that it's using precessional astronomy and architecture to do this. See, if you want to send a message to the future, you would be most unwise to do so in any written language. How can you be sure that your document is ever going to survive over 12,000 years? How can you be sure, even if it does, that the language you've written it in will be understood? You need a universal language, and you need something that will survive a very long period of time, like the pyramids, which defy age. And you need a language that any culture can understand, and that's the language of astronomy. So that's what's suggested here, is that astronomy and architecture are being used to draw our attention to the period between 10,000 and 11,000 BC. Now, it's of interest that this number 72 unites quite a number of archaeological sites around the world, which I've set out on this grid here. They're separated by significant numbers of degrees of longitude. And one of those sites is Angkor in Cambodia, where there are 72 major temples. And Angkor in Cambodia lies 72 degrees of longitude east of Giza. And actually, the word Angkor has a meaning in the ancient Egyptian language. It means life to the Horus. I don't deny that the temples of Angkor, as we see them today in their latest incarnation, were built about 1,000 years ago, around about 1150 AD. That's for sure, they were. But what I'm suggesting is that they are simply the latest incarnation of much earlier temples, and that the site may have been sacred for thousands of years before we see it in its present form. At any rate, this is Angkor Wat. And Angkor Wat, like the Great Pyramid, is carefully aligned to the cardinal directions. And Santa took this photograph from a Cambodian military helicopter hovering over the eastern side of Angkor Wat. And there is the causeway running through the middle of Angkor Wat. And if you position yourself in the middle of this causeway and look east at dawn on the spring equinox, this is what you see. Exactly the same thing that happens at the Sphinx. In the case of Angkor, the sun peeps up the side of the central tower, rolls up the central tower, finds its way towards the top, and eventually sits on the top of the central tower of Angkor Wat. And you understand that this is what Angkor Wat is built to do. As above, so below. It's built to unite heaven and earth at that exact moment on the equinoxes. And I got into a lot of trouble for pointing out that the principal temples of Angkor take the form of a constellation in the heavens, and that constellation is the constellation of Draco. And indeed, the relationship between the stars and the temples is very good, and includes outlying temples like the Roloas temples and the Western Levant. And furthermore, that the diagram, the as above, so below correlation, only works perfectly on the spring equinox in 10,500 BC, exactly as the Giza-Orion-Leo correlation works. Why am I showing a picture of the Hoover Dam? Well, because exactly the same thing has been done at the Hoover Dam. There's a gigantic star map built into the architecture of the Hoover Dam. And what it did was it froze the stars above the Hoover Dam at the time of the dam's completion. Here we have Oscar Hansen, responsible for the star map, saying that he believed that in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication. So this idea of using monumental architecture and precession is not such an alien idea to our culture today. I mean, in a sense, who gives a damn when the Hoover Dam was built? But what's important about it is it tells us that we do this, and therefore why shouldn't the ancients have done this? Here's a king list from the temple of Seti I in Abydos. The ancient Egyptians had very clear ideas about the antiquity of their civilization. They believed that their civilization went back tens of thousands of years to the time of the gods. And they set out their ideas in these king lists. Now actually, what we see here is the pharaoh Seti I showing his young son Ramesses II a list of all the pharaohs who've reigned in Egypt before their time. And actually it's these king lists that are used by Egyptologists to derive the chronology of ancient Egypt. And they take the period from 3000 BC, the first dynasty, down until Ptolemaic times and beyond, to give us the chronology of ancient Egypt. It's annoying for Egyptologists that the king lists don't stop in 3000 BC, that they actually continue back before 3000 BC. And they go back, in some cases, as much as 30,000 years before 3000 BC, into the time of the gods. You know, I think that the ancient Egyptians probably knew a lot more about their history than Egyptologists do. Behind the temple of Seti I at Abydos is this gigantic megalithic structure called the Osirion, which was excavated from beneath 50 feet of silt at the beginning of the 20th century. The Osirion has been attributed to Seti I, even though its architecture is completely different from the temple of Seti I. I believe that the Osirion is one of many monuments in Egypt that is much, much older and that has been misdated. Monuments that are characterized by gigantic megalithic architecture. Now, here is the view of Egyptologists as to how those megaliths were put in place. And this is the view I prefer, is that some kind of unknown technology was employed, that something mysterious and mystical was going on. There are accounts in ancient Egypt of these huge blocks being raised by the priests singing them into place. Just because we do things in certain ways doesn't mean that ancient cultures did them in the same way. And I think we should be open to the idea that ancient Egypt did things in a different way, especially when we look at these extraordinary monuments of the Giza Plateau, like the mortuary temples and the Valley temples, where we find blocks of stone weighing 100 tons each. And my suggestion would be is that at that Valley temple we're looking at a two-phase construction. Yes, the ancient Egyptians were involved. This granite work on the inside of the temple is ancient Egyptian work, but it's cut to fit the limestone blocks on the outside. And my suggestion is that the limestone temple is much, much older. And this is where we get to the Sphinx, because really you have to understand that these temples were built of limestone excavated from around the body of the Sphinx. Whenever the Sphinx was made, that's the time that these megalithic temples were made. And my friend and colleague, John Anthony West, and Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University planted a kind of time bomb under the comfortable bottoms of Egyptology in 1992 when they pointed out that the weathering patterns around the Sphinx, you can't see it much on the core body because the core body has been so much restored. When they pointed out that the weathering patterns around the Sphinx were those caused by exposure to thousands of years of heavy, heavy rainfall, precipitation-induced weathering, and that the Sphinx therefore could not be dated to 2500 BC, but it must be much, much older than that on the basis of the geology. Indeed, it takes us back right to the end of the last ice age. Well, the killer argument of Egyptology on this was the Sphinx, of course, can't be 12,000 years old, because there's no other monument in the world that's 12,000 years old. If there were a culture that were capable of creating gigantic monuments like the Sphinx and moving 100-ton blocks of stone into temples on that scale 12,000 years ago, well, there would be plenty of other monuments of that type as well. So on that basis, Egyptology argued that Schock's work must be completely wrong. And that's why this site in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, where I have just been, is of the greatest interest at the moment, because Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old. And Göbekli Tepe, we know it's 12,000 years old, because whichever mysterious culture created these huge stone circles on the scale of Stonehenge 12,000 years ago, deliberately buried them 2,000 years later. And for the last 10,000 years, Göbekli Tepe has been underneath a man-made pot-bellied hill. In fact, that's what Göbekli Tepe means. It means pot-bellied hill. And what that means is that the carbon dating record has never been contaminated on that site. You see, you can't date stone. You can't date when a piece of stone was cut. What you have to do as an archaeologist is date organic material associated with that stone. But there's a problem. Organic material from later cultures may be introduced to a site, and it may skew the carbon dating record. You may get an idea that a site is a certain date, but it's not. It's only the organic material that's dated. This is all ruled out in the case of Göbekli Tepe because it was deliberately buried like a time capsule, and has only been exposed in the last decade by Professor Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, who I'm talking with here. And Klaus Schmidt is what he's telling me actually at this point is that what we're seeing now, the bit he's excavated at Göbekli Tepe, those four stone circles, that's just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the rest of it. That there's at least 20 times as much still under the ground, if not 50 times as much. They've done ground-penetrating radar. So Göbekli Tepe is an absolutely gigantic site, a huge work of planning and organization. It is 12,000 years old, and this, annoyingly for archaeology, is the Upper Paleolithic. There is one of the unfinished pillars from Göbekli Tepe, cut, left in the quarry because a fault was discovered in it, which weighs an estimated 50 tons. Now, you don't just wake up one morning as a hunter-gatherer and decide that you're going to create gigantic stone circles with 50-ton megaliths. You don't, just overnight create the site planning and organization and architectural skills to do that, to bring together teams of hundreds of people to create a site like this. There has to be a background to it, and the background is missing. Göbekli Tepe just appears out of nowhere, like a sort of miracle. And what I think it's going to do is require us to reconsider the dating of a lot of other megalithic sites around the world, like Baalbek, where Baalbek has been given to the Romans because there's a temple of Jupiter on top of its megalithic foundations. But let's consider the possibility that the Romans found those megalithic foundations and built a temple of Jupiter on top of them. Maybe we're making a mistake giving the whole site to the Romans. And look at the shape of Göbekli Tepe and compare it with this place in Malta, Manajdra, which is attributed to the period of about 5,000 years ago. See, if you take a big megalithic site like this and attribute it to 5,000 years ago, you're not rocking the boat of history. That fits in with the historical period. There's been 5,000 years since the Upper Paleolithic, during the Neolithic, to develop the skills. But what we have to now consider is that the Maltese temples may have been misdated by archaeology. Indeed, as I've long suspected, this is the Hypogeum, carved out of solid rock underground in Malta. And in the Hypogeum and around it were found these goddess figures. Now, archaeology attributes the goddess figures to 5,000 years ago. It would be very annoying if they were older than 5,000 years ago in a site that is 5,000 years old. But there are goddess figures which are much older than that. The Venus of Hohlefels is 40,000 years old. Dolny Vostonice, 29,000 years old. Lozelle, 25,000 years old. Willendorf, 26,000 years old. Why should the Maltese goddess figures be just 5,000 years old? Because that happens not to rock the boat of history, given the site that they're found in. This is inside the Hypogeum, and painted on the ceiling of the Hypogeum are certain red ochre marks. And these red ochre marks are a bit reminiscent of what we call cave paintings from the Upper Paleolithic, which were done with red ochre. I have a friend in Malta who's called Anton Mifsud, and he is, in fact, the chief pediatrician at the main hospital in Malta. He's also a gifted amateur archaeologist, and he has proved to be a thorn in the flesh of the Maltese archaeological establishment, because he has unearthed a scandal concerning the Hypogeum. It turns out that on the walls of the Hypogeum, at one point was painted a hybrid creature, a bison bull, a classic Upper Paleolithic image, something if we found it in one of the painted caves we would recognize immediately as belonging to the period of 12,000 years ago or much earlier. This caused some embarrassment to F.S. Malia, the director of the Maltese Museums, and he solved the embarrassment. This is a letter that we wrote to the Maltese Museums. He solved the problem by scrubbing the bison bull off the walls of the Hypogeum. Unfortunately for him, it's documented in some earlier publications, so he can't rub it out from history entirely. And when we tackled the Maltese Museums about this, they fell into a guilty silence and refused to answer any questions about it at all. There's something else. I'm sitting here with Anton Mifsud, that same thorn in the flesh of the Maltese establishment, in the so-called cart ruts of Malta. And I have to say, some cart, some ruts. These cart ruts are thought to date from the same period as the megalithic temples, about 5,000 years ago, perhaps a little bit less. But again, annoyingly for archaeology, they continue underwater. And they actually go down more than 100 feet underwater off the Maltese Islands. And the science of sea level rise tells us that they've been submerged for more than 12,000 years. So what I'm saying is, maybe the Maltese temples and the whole Maltese archaeological story has been misunderstood. Let's hop over further west now to the Balearic Islands, to the island of Minorca. And there we find T-shaped megaliths dated only to 3,000 years or so ago by mainstream archaeology, which are identical to the megaliths on Göbekli Tepe. Maybe the Minorcan megaliths have also been misunderstood, and perhaps also the megaliths of Morocco, particularly when we recall that there are ancient maps based on older source maps which show huge lakes in the northern Sahara. The last time there were huge lakes in the northern Sahara was during the Ice Age, more than 12,000 years ago. This is our beautiful planet as she looks today, and she hasn't always looked that way, because during the Ice Age, these huge ice caps up to 2 miles deep covered North America and indeed covered Northern Europe as well. And this ice began to set in about 125,000 years ago, and it reached its maximum extent around 21,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum. And what it meant was that sea levels were much lower. They were actually 400 feet lower during the Ice Age than they are today. This is the world as it looks today, and this is how it looked pretty much during the Ice Age. Not so different at first, but then you notice that there was no Red Sea, there was no Persian Gulf, Sri Lanka was joined to India, Southeast Asia was this gigantic continent-sized landmass, not a peninsula and series of islands. Australia was joined to New Guinea. Coastlines everywhere were much more extensive. 10 million square miles of land went underwater at the end of the Ice Age. That's Europe and China added together. This is the famous Piri-Reis map, which is a map that I've talked about a lot. It's of great interest. It was created in 1513 by a Turkish admiral called Piri-Reis, who was later beheaded by the Ottoman Sultan. And Piri-Reis tells us in his own handwriting on the map, which was once a world map, only a fragment of it has survived, that he based it on more than 100 older source maps. He was concerned to preserve the information in those source maps because they were fragile, they were very ancient, they were falling apart. If they were left much longer, they would crumble away. So he wanted to copy them down and create a world map that included their information. And this is what his map does. This bit of his map shows the west coast of Africa and the east coast of the Americas. Up here, roughly where the Grand Bahama Banks are today, is an island, which doesn't exist today. And if we look closely at that island, we can see that a row of megaliths run right up the middle of it. Interestingly, if you go diving in exactly that place, you find yourself on the feature called the Bimini Road, which is said to be a totally natural feature. Actually, I don't care whether it's natural or man-made. What's interesting to me is that it's documented above water on this map. And that means that this map is showing us the world as it looked during the last ice age, not as it looked in 1513. And that adds strength to the argument that the Piri-Reis map also shows Antarctica. A greatly extended Antarctica that almost touched South America as it did during the last ice age. This is Antarctica as we know it today, and this is Antarctica on honest maps of the early 1800s. It isn't there. The reason it isn't there is that our culture didn't discover Antarctica until 1818. So if you were an honest map maker basing your work on the latest science in 1806, then you would not show Antarctica on your map. So the problem is, why does Antarctica appear on much earlier maps? Why does it appear again and again on the Orontius Phineas map, for example, or on the Mercator map? And why does it appear in this enlarged form, but in exactly the right place? And what's in common with all these maps is that they are based on older source maps, now lost to us. That they are preserving, it seems, information from a culture that mapped the world during the last ice age. I always find this one of particular interest, this Ptolemaic map of the British Isles, which shows us a little island off the west coast of Ireland. And that little island is actually called High Brazil. That island did not exist when this map was made, but it did exist 12,000 years ago. If you go back and simulate the sea level changes, you'll find that an island was in exactly the right place and of exactly the right size between 12 and 13,000 years ago. And this extended coast of Southeast Asia, to my eye, looks much more like Southeast Asia during the Ice Age than it looks like Southeast Asia in 1507. And talking about Southeast Asia, I want to take you to West Java now, and to a place called Gunung Padang, which is also on the verge of completely rewriting history. And again, it's a geologist who's involved. I've just been in touch with Danny Hillman, the geologist concerned, yesterday, and Santa and I are going to be going out to Indonesia on the 4th of December, where he and his team will unfold their findings, which have already been previewed in the press. And this site, Gunung Padang, which has these extraordinary basalt megaliths, has been known since 1914. And since 1914, it's been recognized as old, but thought to be about 3,000 or 4,000 years old. A 3,000 or 4,000 year old megalithic site doesn't rock the boat of history. But what Danny Hillman and his team have discovered after 5 years of a detailed site survey at Gunung Padang is, and this is Danny Hillman's own words, it's older than 9,000 years, and it could be up to 20,000 years. And he admits it's a strong case, but not an easy case. We're up against the world's belief. Because once you start saying that sites are this old, then the whole story of history has to be reconsidered, and whole careers go down the tubes, and a vast investment in an understanding of our past that mainstream history and archaeology has put together over the last 100 years is just up for grabs completely, and you can't expect to get away with that without a great deal of difficulty and trouble. So here are some more views of Gunung Padang. And it's interesting, if we look at this style of construction, how similar it is to another place, and that place is called Ponape, not actually that far from West Java. And Ponape is on this, what I call this precessional grid. And when you go to Ponape, you find that you're looking at pyramid-shaped hills, rather like Gunung Padang, and you find that you're looking at structures which are built in exactly the same way as Gunung Padang, and with exactly the same materials. This is Nan Duas, the most prominent structure of Nan Madol. And if you look at Gunung Padang up above and Nan Duas underneath, you can see the very close similarity between the two. But Nan Duas is only supposed to be 800 years old. Maybe something's gone wrong with the dating on this site, particularly when we go diving off the site, and we find that it continues underwater and just keeps on going down and down until we find these huge pillars standing up off the seabed, and we find some of them fallen to the ground and some of them looking like this. And I couldn't help noticing the astonishing similarity of these pillars to the pillars of the island of Tinian, not very far away from Nan Duas. And I can't help feeling that there's a whole hidden story there. There is Tinian as we see it today. Japan now. We still have a lot of ground to get through, but we're getting there. This is an ancient map of Japan, actually, from 1424. And it shows the three islands of Japan, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, as one island. And it shows a deep inlet here and another deep inlet here. And interestingly, that's exactly how Japan looked around 12,400 years ago, when the Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu were all one landmass. And there was a deep inlet here and here. It's not how Japan looks today. And I now want to briefly take you diving off Japan to the extraordinary megalithic site off the island of Yonaguni, where Santa and I put in well over 200 dives over a number of years. And these two pillars, these two megalithic blocks side by side, according to mainstream archaeology, are totally natural, and they actually must have fallen into place there. Because, of course, nobody could have put them there because their depth of submergence underwater means that they're more than 12,000 years old. The fact that there is no cliff immediately above this point where these blocks could have fallen into place from does not discourage that argument, it seems. Now, let's take a look at them in context. There they stand against a huge rocky outcrop. I'm, of course, not complaining that I'm not claiming that that rocky outcrop is man-made, but rocky outcrops can be carved and hewn into shape. And when we swim in this direction, round here, we pretty soon find ourselves here at the terraces of Yonaguni. Yonaguni is the most southwestern of all the Japanese islands. And these terraces certainly look man-made to me. The argument that mainstream archaeology gives is that the sea rising and beating against this rocky outcrop selectively removed the softer layers of rock and left the harder layers in place, and that's why we get the stepped appearance. Because it cannot possibly be man-made, because no culture was present 12,000 years ago in Japan capable of making a monument like this. Well, if their argument is correct, then I want to know where all this rubble is. And I would expect to find it down here, because there's a drop-off there. And what I instead find at the bottom of that drop-off is a clear pathway running along the base of the monument. And when we get closer, we notice that the rubble has all been moved to one side, and the pathway is left clear. And indeed, there are gutters running along the side of the pathway. This, to me, is definitely man-made work, and I have spent an awful lot of time on this site and on every aspect of it, and I cannot accept that it's a work of nature. Like this face, with two eyes, a nose, and a mouth, gazing due south, also at Yonaguni. And indeed, there are pupils in the eyes, and we can notice, if we look closely, one of the great things about diving is you can hover upside down like this. We can notice, if you look closely, that there's a headdress on this figure, the remnants of a headdress, and the head itself has been cleanly separated off from the rocky outcrop in which it is formed, giving the appearance of a head. And when we pull back, we find that it's situated in a context, and again, there are gutters running down the sides of this avenue here. If we go north now to Okinawa and go diving 40 miles west of Okinawa off the Kerama group of islands, we'll find cemented to the seabed little groups of river stones like these, but much more interesting, associated with them are two huge stone circles. And these huge stone circles have been cut out of solid bedrock. They're not built, they're literally cut out of the bedrock. And again, I can't think of any way that nature could have made these gigantic formations on the bottom of the sea, with a central upright and the outer uprights running around it in a spiral. And indeed, if you look here, you can see that the inner curve on the outer upright matches the outer curve on the central upright. 110 feet beneath the sea, been submerged for more than 12,000 years. This is the work of a lost human culture, I have absolutely no doubt. Let's now jump way over here to Easter Island, which is the exception that proves the rule as far as this grid is concerned. Because Easter Island today is about 70 miles off the precessional grid. But Easter Island hasn't always looked the way it looks today. If you go back into the Ice Age, you'll find there was a time when Easter Island was part of a gigantic archipelago of islands that were above water. And indeed, the largest of those islands stood exactly on the precessional grid, somewhat more than 12,000 years ago. Now, of course, the statues of Easter Island are extremely famous, and they are said by archaeology to date to about 800 years ago, not much more. But I want to question that, and one of the reasons I want to question it is, let's look at this platform on which these statues stand, which is a rather badly made platform. And lo and behold, amongst the blocks worked into this platform is an ancient Easter Island head. It's part of that platform. Is it possible that a later culture came along and did some salvage work on Easter Island? Is it possible that some statues lying around were re-erected and that these poor quality platforms are the work of a later culture, not of the work of the culture that made the original statues? This is the Ranaraku Quarry, where we see many statues sticking out of the ground in a rather eerie manner. And one might imagine that they just go a few feet beneath the ground. But Thor Heyerdahl, who I had the privilege of knowing, did a major excavation on Easter Island in the 1950s. And what he demonstrated is that these statues actually go 30 feet beneath the ground. That's Thor standing there in his blue safari suit. And there you can see the sedimentation, because this is where Robert Schoch, the geologist who did the work on the redating of the Sphinx, has come up with another major problem for archaeology. Robert Schoch's visited Easter Island, and he studied this site very carefully, and he's of the opinion that this is sedimentation, that these statues have been covered by thousands of years of sedimentation, not possible in 700 or 800 years. You don't get 30 feet of sedimentation in 700 or 800 years. And that therefore, it's possible that the Easter Island statues are thousands of years old, not hundreds of years old. And here's something else interesting that anybody who's been to Göbekli Tepe and Easter Island will immediately notice. See, these Göbekli Tepe pillars, they're actually humanoid in form. This represents the head of the figure, and you may just notice here that there are two little hands crossing in front of the belly of the figure. The same hands cross in front of the belly of the Easter Island figures. I'll show it more clearly here. There you can see the crooked arms and the long, thin fingers of the Göbekli Tepe pillar, and the exact same body posture on the Easter Island figure here. Is it a coincidence, or could there be a connection? Even the belt is rather similar, as a matter of fact. This figure was found at Urfa near Göbekli Tepe. It's thought to be about 11,000 years old. Same body posture, same crossing of the hands in front of the belly shown there. And here is a very well-made wall on Easter Island. This is a platform that's quite different from the other platforms that we see. And when you get close to that platform, you find that it's actually built in a kind of jigsaw puzzle pattern. And I want to compare it with this platform at Silustani in Peru, which is built in exactly the same way. There's the Easter Island platform, and there's the Silustani platform. And just as we have this little jigsaw puzzle block here, we've got exactly the same thing at Silustani in Peru, in a monument that has been attributed to the Incas, but which I would suggest is much, much older than that. And in fact, what that monument is part of is a whole system of megalithic architecture throughout the Andes, which I will argue has been wrongly attributed to the Incas. The Incas have been given everything, when in fact they were only responsible for recent and rather poor quality work in the Andes. And I've had the privilege just recently of visiting this site and looking at these astonishing rock-hewn elements of the site with a gentleman called Jesus Gamarra. And Jesus Gamarra is of Inca descent, and he and his father before him have been studying the monuments between them for about 100 years. As people descended from the Incas, one would expect them to want the Incas to have done everything, but they've come to the conclusion that archaeologists have made a huge mistake, and that the Incas were just the recent inhabitants of much more ancient megalithic sites, and that the Inca work is quite different in style from the megalithic work. And they see three epochs of construction. This is again Jesus Gamarra. They see three epochs of construction, and they even suggest that this was not cut out using hammers and chisels, that this was a heat-treated rock, and that these were the result of a moulding effect, or pressing down into the rock that had been softened by heat. It's really quite interesting when you get into the details and wander around these Inca sites, so-called Inca sites, and have a look at what is going on there. You find vitrified stone, you find these amazing precision-cut channels, and what Jesus Gamarra is suggesting is that there are three periods of construction, and that these huge megalithic blocks, which seem melted together, belong to the second period that he calls Uran Pacha, which he dates to more than 12,000 years ago. And he suggests that there was an even earlier period before that, but that this work is the Inca work. This is the island of the moon. He calls it Uran Pacha, and he doesn't argue about that. He says this is Inca work, but this was a very sacred site to the Incas, but look at the quality of the work. The work is nothing like the work of those gigantic megalithic constructions. Are we really to believe that this is the same work as the huge megalithic blocks of Sacsayhuaman? And you can see it in the city of Cusco itself. You can see fantastic megaliths, which are just unbelievably precisely joined together. And then you can see this very poor quality workmanship alongside them. This, Jesus argues, is the Inca work, and this is the work of a prehistoric culture. And archaeology has made the mistake of lumping them all together and giving them all to the Incas. And even an earlier culture represented by this rock-hewn block, and then the two different styles from different periods. Ollantaytambo, up in the mountains, is another one of these sites that will need to be redated according to Jesus Gamarra. And on the walls of Ollantaytambo we see this step pyramid form. And indeed there is a step pyramid in the Andes, and it's at the amazing site of Tiwanaku, looking down from an aerial photograph here, and that's what's left of the Acapana pyramid, and beside it the so-called Kalasa Sia. And nearby is the Gateway of the Sun. Now the Gateway of the Sun is presently here in the Acapana, in the Kalasa Sia. but there's a strong argument, really firm evidence, that it once stood here in the middle and that it got moved over here in relatively modern times. On the Gateway of the Sun is carved a figure that looks a whole lot like a mammoth to me, with 2 eyes, 2 big ears, a trunk and 2 tusks. But to be fair, there's an argument that it's not a mammoth. There's an argument that it's in fact 2 condors facing one another. So let's look at that argument, because the same pattern is repeated on the other side of the Gateway of the Sun. Except there's a difference. If you look at it on this side, you can see that there's a clear demarcation line, and the figure of the 2 condors is quite clear. The one on this side looks superficially similar, but when you get to grips with it, it's quite different. And it has a trunk and 2 tusks. I feel that some kind of game is being played here. A game of fractals and similarities, but with differences. If this is a mammoth, then the Gateway of the Sun is at least 6,000 years old, if not older, because that's the last time that elephants existed in the Andes. Now, astronomy suggests that Tiwanaku is more than 12,000 years old. And up at Tiwanaku, 14,000 feet above sea level, we have these astonishing megalithic blocks. I mean, just absolutely gigantic. And let's go take a close look at that one there. And we will discover just how big it is. It beggars belief how this work was done. I think any reasonable person has to admit that we are looking at something we don't understand here. 14,000 feet above sea level, blocks weighing hundreds of tons. And precision work being done on those blocks. These look to me like they had metal pieces fitted into them at one time. The metal pieces are missing and we're left with the molds into which they were placed. And something else is this H motif at Tiwanaku. And we find the same H motif on the belts of the figures at Göbekli Tepe. Here is Kutimbo in the Andes, and there are animal figures carved on Kutimbo. I was struck by the similarity between this figure and this figure from Göbekli Tepe. And if we go closer to these towers, we can see more animal figures carved on them, attributed to the Incas. And again, there are curious similarities with the animal figures carved at Göbekli Tepe. Very striking similarities between these 2 figures to my eye. And these figures with the curved tail, like these leonine figures from Göbekli Tepe. And this in particular from Göbekli Tepe on the right and from Kutimbo on the left. Again, I'm not claiming anything from this, I'm just struck by the similarities going on here. Here from the so-called Temple of the Moon outside of Cusco, we see a serpent with a very large head. Almost more like a newt or a sperm than a serpent. And exactly the same serpent with the very large head is found at Göbekli Tepe. And here at Göbekli Tepe, this most unusual monolith with a figure with the arms in front of it here, almost as though it's drumming and emerging from the stone, and exactly the same posture on these figures from Kutimbo. Back to Tiwanaku. What are these monoliths holding in their hands? Not ray guns, in my opinion. And nor in the opinion of Manuel Torres either. Because what he's demonstrated is that what these actually are snuff trays, in which the powdered seeds of an Adenanthera colubrina, which contain the potent hallucinogen dimethyltryptamine, were snuffed. In other words, we have to take account of the use of visionary plants in the ancient culture of Tiwanaku. And we have to recognize that these plants come from the Amazon. Here's a Spanish gentleman who went hunting on the Amazon in a small boat in 1541, on the 26th of December and ended up on the 26th of August 1542 in the Atlantic Ocean. He was carried 4,000 miles to the coast, Francisco de Orellana, and on the way on that journey he documented the existence of huge cities in the Amazon. He was considered to be a fantasist who'd made it all up. How could there be cities in the Amazon jungle? Pristine jungle, nobody could make cities there. But the tragic clearances of the Amazon have revealed that indeed there were cities in the Amazon, and that these cities are of the greatest antiquity. They were depopulated as a result of smallpox introduced by the Spaniards, and fell back under the jungle. Something else from the Amazon is terra preta, this black soil, which is a mysterious, self-replicating, man-made Amazonian soil. And the scientific studies suggest that it goes back at least 11,000 years. Astonishingly fertile soil. Was there some civilization in the Amazon? Is the Amazon like a desert which changed its face and hides the stories? Is it like the ocean which covers so many of the works of man? Is the Amazon also a place where there are traces of a lost civilization? Huge earthworks are emerging from the Amazon jungle today following the clearances in the Amazon. And even stone circles and megalithic sites are being found in Brazil. And what about the pharmacology of the Amazon, where there are 150,000 different species of plants and trees, and two of them put together, this one up here, the bush Psychotria viridis, contains dimethyltryptamine, but DMT is not normally orally active. There's an enzyme in our stomachs called monoamine oxidase that switches off DMT on contact. In the Amazon, they worked out to mix the DMT-bearing leaves with the ayahuasca vine. The ayahuasca vine contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. This is really quite an astonishing feat of ethnopharmacology, to mix the two together to produce a highly psychoactive brew. And interestingly, dimethyltryptamine also figures in the ancient Egyptian tree of life, which is Acacia nilotica, a DMT-bearing species. Now, it takes quite a bit of chemistry to get the DMT out of the bark of Acacia nilotica. But where do we get the word chemistry from? The ancient name of Egypt was Kemet. The Arabs knew Egypt as Alkemt, from which we get the name, the word alchemy. Indeed, the very word chemistry comes from ancient Egypt. So I think we need to take seriously the possibility that the ancient Egyptians were, like those in Tiwanaku, working with visionary plants, and therefore need to consider the hidden meaning of imagery like this from ancient Egypt, because we all have DMT in our bodies. It's produced in the pineal gland, and that is what is being signaled here in this imagery from the second shrine of Tutankhamun. We're getting near the end of this talk now, I promise. We'll be done in 5 minutes or so. I want to go back to this diagram, which, as above, so below, which freezes the skies and monumentalizes them in architecture, and draws attention to the period between 12 and 13,000 years ago. Are we being told that something of great significance for the world happened in this period? Something that led to the destruction of a great global civilization? Something on a scale that would justify the initiation of gigantic astro-architectural projects around the globe to mark and commemorate it? When I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, I had a strong intuition that these events were concerned with the end of the last ice age. But I didn't know exactly what was going on. I proposed various theories, including Earth crust displacement, as the cataclysmic agent, but I couldn't really identify a smoking gun. And that was one of the issues for which I was strongly criticized by academia at the time. We now have a smoking gun. And that smoking gun is a comet. Now, I think everybody remembers Shoemaker-Levy 9, that hit Jupiter with spectacular effects in 1994. A fragmenting comet, that a sort of freight train of a comet that smashed into the planet Jupiter. Which reminds me that this is the time to say, thank you, Jupiter. That huge planet circling in the outer solar system with its immense gravity, drawing in comets, asteroids that otherwise might hit the Earth. If Shoemaker-Levy 9 had hit the Earth, none of us would be here today. And arguably there would never have been life on Earth if it were not for the planet Jupiter, sweeping up so many of these cosmic impactors. But occasionally a comet gets through. And it's been the subject of argument since 2007, and the argument has been quite heated at times, but it is now clear, quite clear, that North America was hit by a gigantic fragmenting comet, and you can pin it down exactly to 12,980 years ago, give or take 5 years, according to the Greenland ice cores. It's very, very, very clear. It's stopped being an argument. It's become quite certain that a comet swarm did strike America 13,000 years ago, well, 12,980 exactly, and that it was responsible for what has hitherto been a mystery, which is called the Younger Dryas. That there was just as the world was coming out of the Ice Age, there was a 1,000-year deep freeze. Everything froze up again. There was a huge extinction of animal species. And undoubtedly, this happened because of the comet impact sending up enormous dust clouds into the upper atmosphere and reflecting back the sun's rays for 1,000 years, causing that mysterious event called the Younger Dryas. And no, I don't think it was just the Clovis people who were killed off by that impact. I would suggest that's the smoking gun. That's when we lost a whole civilization. That's when we became a species with amnesia. The Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt is a fascinating place. It's rather like those ancient maps. It's rather like those maps that were copied from older source maps in the 15 or 1600s to preserve the source. The Temple of Edfu contains inscribed on its walls a document that was fragile and falling apart when the Temple of Edfu was built. And the builders of the Temple of Edfu inscribed it there to memorialize it forever. And this is called the Edfu building texts, which speak of a homeland of the primeval ones that was destroyed in a great flood, and tell how the primeval ones, the gods, came to Egypt and established religion by building primeval mounds up and down the land. Every temple, every pyramid stands on foundations that go back to the time of the gods. And it speaks of a global cataclysm and of a gigantic disaster. And it speaks of civilizers who came to Egypt. Are they like the Viracochas from the Andes, whose images we see carved at Tiwanaku, these bearded strangers who do not look like indigenous American Indians? Are they like the bearded figures from Central America, associated with the imagery of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent? Even those Easter Island heads, by the way, I'm just going to move on rapidly here. Even those Easter Island heads, if you look closely, those huge chins are bearded. These are bearded figures that we're looking at here. And I want to close with this bearded figure. And a couple of things about him. One, why is he wearing a fish on his head? And two, why is he carrying a man bag? Like these guys, with these cute little man bags. What is going on here? Okay, he's wearing a fish on his head because actually he's called a fish-garbed figure. And he represents a figure from mythology called Oannes, who was said to have emerged from the waters of the ocean after a great all-destroying flood, bringing civilization to mankind. The fish symbolizes his ability to survive the flood. So that's explained. But what about the man bags? What is going on there? And why, this is from Babylon and Sumer, but why do we find the same man bag in the hands of the feathered serpent figure on the other side of the world at supposedly a different period of history? What is going on here? Is it the symbol of the survivors of the lost civilization? Is it some kind of badge of office? Particularly so when the same man bag turns up at Göbekli Tepe on pillars that we now know are more than 12,000 years old. I think there's a great mystery contained in all of this, and I feel privileged to have the opportunity to look into this mystery, and I will be presenting all my findings on this sometime during 2015. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.